So what we're going to do in these 30 minutes, we're going to talk a little bit how Coface analyze countries, how we provide the risk, how we analyze and we decide that the country is stable or not stable. In this first part, we are going to talk about developing countries. And I think it's really important, first of all, to know where we are. I'm sure that you know it, but who is buying Portuguese companies? Who are where you are selling? And this is the country of destination today. If you think about it, today there are many people that are talking about selling. Everyone wants to sell. The question is, who is buying? So one of the things that we are going to do in this presentation perhaps is focus most in what is the situation in Spain, in Germany, in France, in Italy, and in the second part we will talk about the situation of emerging countries. In the past was 2008, I mean, Portuguese and Spanish companies, they were selling like 80–90% of the goods and services that were being sold in the European Union, but this is changing. Why this is changing? Because as we have seen in the previous speaker, the demand is coming from emerging countries. A part of the exports, it's important to know where you are importing, and once again, if you look at it, we have Spain and these European big economies like France and Germany, but it's true that suddenly there is another big economies, emerging economies like China, Brazil, and Angola, for example, that I guess is going to be quite important for you to know what are the expectations, what is going to be the growth of these countries in the next year. So this slide is something that has appeared before with previous speakers, but why today so many people talk about GDP? About PIB. Why is so important the PIB? If you think about it, this famous PIB that 4 years ago not many people talk about it, the PIB is the consumption, is the investment, is the government spending, and is the net exports. We will say that it's families, corporates, government, and net exports. And if you think about it, all the companies that you are here, usually you work either with companies or with citizens, or you are selling to the government. So it's quite important to know what is doing the GDP of your own country or the country of destination. Second issue, today we are talking a lot about what is the net exports, or why it's so important to have a sound current account. If you think about it, if you have a surplus in the current account, that means usually in that you are selling more than you are buying, you are a lender. For example, today, China is a lender. Why? Because they have a huge surplus in the current account. But if you are buying more than what you are selling, what happens is that you are a debtor. And then you have problems, because you have to go to the market. The markets are really bad, and they are asking a really high premium to Portuguese bonds, Spanish bonds, and many European bonds. So one thing that you have to look after is what is happening with the countries, with your own country, and when the countries that you are trying to work regarding the GDP, the PIB, and regarding the exportaciones and importaciones, because it's quite important to follow the relation with your own country. When we did this conference weeks ago, I mean, there was some big exporter that told me it's a little bit depressing, this story about country risk conference, because today when you talk about how the world is doing, everything that the countries are doing quite bad. I think there is some signs of improvement. If you think about it, we are talking that, for example, the GDP in Portuguese is going to have a minus 1.6 in 2012. This is not good for sure, but the point is that last year you were at minus 3.2. So there has been clearly an improvement. When we are talking about how the exports are doing, if you think about it, the 2013, the exports in Portuguese, they are going to end like around 5.8. If you compare with the 3.2, that's once again, this is something that is improvement. And if you think about it, we are expecting the world output, the whole world, to grow like 3.6 in 2014. The advanced economies will be around 2%, and the euro area is going to be around 1%. There has been two famous Harvard economists, Rogers and Reinhard, that they said that if an economy is not growing above 2%, you cannot grow employment. We are not so sure about that. We think that, for example, Portugal and Spain are going to grow employment, growing less than 2%, but it's true that when we look after the figures, they are at least a little bit better than what they were a year before. So what is going to happen with the big growth transition? What has happened since the last big crisis in 2008? It's been painful and it's true, unfair. Why we say that it's been painful and unfair? Because if you look after the government spending, we expect the government in Portugal, in Europe, in the US to spend a lot of money. If you look after the green line, you see that it's decreasing in all the developing economies. So it's true that a lot of things that were given for granted in the last 5 years, today are disappearing. Why? Because the government has to cut expenses. And this is really important because we are having a transition that a lot of people say that is unfair. So what is the recovery that perhaps we will dream of? First of all, I mean, today a lot of people have learned a huge amount of economy in this crisis. But the first thing is this that is called the internal devaluation. What is the internal devaluation? In the past, when a country wants to improve the exports, the only thing that they have to do was to decrease the value of the currency. The problem that you have in Portugal or even in Spain is that we can't do that anymore. So one of the things that we are facing is that we have to decrease the price of our products. How? Once again, it's painful because what we are seeing is that many times are the salaries, the ones that they are decreasing when you are a country that you are exporting goods, mainly goods more than services. The second thing is that when you are able to save, you are able to invest. And it's really important to invest. Why? Because you need to have investment in order to fulfill that external demand that is coming to Portugal in this case. Then you have an exporting demand that what is bringing to you is an increase of employment. If you think about it, that companies that they are exporting, they need perhaps more employees in order to fulfill that external demand. So this is going to come from outside. And at the end, when you are able to export, the idea is that the domestic demand is going to increase in the future. So first of all, we have this internal devaluation, then we have the increase of investment, then we have the exports. And after the exports, what we have is the increase of internal demand. It's a little bit difficult to go to the fourth step if you haven't fulfilled the first three. So the recovery that we have is this one. I insist Portugal is not here because we are focusing in the countries that you are selling today. And if you think about it, after 2012, there has been a recovery, a clear recovery, in Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. This is quite important. When we look after how the US, the UK, and Japan had performed in this year, in 2013, I mean, it's a little bit different. But the good thing is that developing countries are performing better than last year. One thing also that is quite important is the business confidence. There is a lot of corporates here in this room, just here in this conference. And it's really important, what is your expected, what do you expect about what is going to happen next year? Do you have confidence in what your buyers are going to buy, how the countries are going to perform? What you see is 2009 was horrible. 2009 was completely horrible. Most of the companies thought that 2008 was bad, but the 2009 was going to be worse. After 2009, this has recovered a little bit. The problem that we have a really short cycle. A really short cycle. During the 2011, it looked like we were improving, and after 2011, just really fast, we began to decrease again. So these developing economies, these advanced economies, if you look at after it, what we are seeing is that they are going to perform in 2014 better than in 2013. 2014 is the green line, and if you look at it, I mean, apart of Japan, for sure, the problem is that, I mean, the green line is higher than the blue line, so they are going to perform better next year. That means that perhaps it's going to be more demand for Portuguese products that you are trying to allocate them. That is quite important. I said before, the euro area is going to grow 1% in 2013. This is bad. Of course, it's not a really good figure, but in 2013, we are supposed to decrease in minus 0.4. So once again, we are going to multiply by 4, by 3.5 or something like that, our increase to next year. And this is really important. We are going to focus a little bit in some big economies. First of all, for example, the US. Why we always focus in the US? Because the US is the biggest GDP worldwide. I mean, it's the biggest economy, and we are saying, yes, they will. I mean, you have here, once again, a huge amount of information, but what you are seeing here, this is the GDP, this is the GDP, the PIB, how it's going around, and we are expecting to have an increase of 1.5 in 2014. That is good for an economy of 250 million. And once again, what we're trying to see, what is the private consumption? I'm sure that here there is a lot of companies that they are trying to sell goods to the US. We have to increase the goods to the US. Why? Because the US is the biggest seller. It's the biggest buyer, worldwide. What is happening also regarding the household consumption? We think that the household consumption, what it brings is that buyers, through the whole country, they want more products. They want Portuguese products, so they are going to import more. And if you think about how the household consumption is doing in these last 2 years, it's really low. It's low. Has to increase a little bit, and it's really important. This business investment, this is something that we look after, because if the business investment is increasing, means that once again the companies in the US are investing because they want to export. They want to export, they need more employment, the people who is unemployed goes down, and after that what happens is that the consumption increases, and this is quite important. What has happened with Germany? Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. This is not something that we are going to discover, but I want you to focus there are people from German companies here, but one of the things that we have to remember is that Germany in the 90s was called the sick man of Europe. The sick man of Europe. I mean, Germany hasn't been performing like now in the last 20 or 30 years. But one true thing that is happening to Germany is that in the last 3 years, one thing that has been managed by the government is that they have a well-sealed window. They were close to the situation that, for example, we were facing in Portugal, in Spain, or in Italy. But what happens? I mean, if at the end you are a country that basically you export, you have to realize that if the demand in Spain or the demand in Portugal decrease, then you have a problem because you are exporting to those countries. So one of the things that you cannot do is just to seal your country. You have to think about that you have to bring the growth to the rest of Europe. What we try to compare in this information here is the difference between the insolvencies in Spain, in France and Germany. Why? Because they are the two biggest economies in the European Union, and as you see, the green line is Germany and the blue line is France. One of the good things, I mean, there has been big defaults in the last year in Germany, but in average, it's a country that is performing regarding insolvencies pretty well and pretty sound, what is important. What is happening with France? With France being the second biggest economy in the European Union, we are saying here that lucky for now. What means lucky for now? It's true that, I mean, the growth is quite low. I mean, we are forecasting a 0.6 for next year. And one of the things that is happening is that the government has to spend a huge amount of money with some of the politics that has been implemented by the Holland government. And it will be really interesting to look after this situation very carefully if you are working with that country. Because one of the things that we try to look after, if you think about it, we cover insolvencies. In Coface, we are covering the commercial and the political risks and the acts of God, the situation like in Philippines right now. And how many defaults we have had in the last years in France? This is the blue line, and what we have is the insolvencies. Up till June 2013, we are talking about 61,000 insolvencies. That's a huge amount even for France. Then what we have is the cost of that insolvencies, because that means that perhaps some importer in France is not paying to you. And the last one is the jobs and the spread, because the main issue that most of the governments are facing in Europe is that they want to grow the employment in order to improve the situation in the country. What is happening about Spain? I mean, Spain is different for sure, and I know it, but the thing is that a part of being different is something is happening. Something is happening. We have improved hugely our deficit in the current account. Spain used to have a huge deficit in the current account, and suddenly in 2013 is the second time in the last 70 years that we are having a surplus in the current account. Our government has a huge deficit, But if you start having a surplus in the current account, that means that perhaps you are going to be able to lend money instead of asking for money. And this is important because the situation that we are facing is the big problem that we have in Spain, apart of the improving of the current account, is what is happening with the credit. I mean, the lack of credit to the corporates. And sometimes this lack of credit perhaps could have an effect in some Portuguese sellers. The Italian puzzle. I mean, Italy is a great country. I'm sure that here there is, I mean, perhaps there are some people that work very heavily with Italian. But Italy is a big puzzle. When we say that it's a big puzzle, it means that, I mean, there is a huge amount of expectation always regarding this country. It's one of the biggest economies in Europe, in the world. But it's true that the rating of insolvencies in the 2013 has increased heavily regarding 2012. So it's another country that we have to look very carefully after that. So the question that we have to face is that is Europe competitive? So this is the internal devaluation, is what I was asking. I mean, what has happened? You think the green line, for example, is Italy. Looks like labor costs in Italy are increasing instead of decreasing. That's bad news for them. But for example, this is Portugal. That means that all the people in this room, a lot of corporates in Portugal, have made a huge effort in the last years. The point, we have done enough. In Spain, for example, this line, the purple line. See where the Germans are. So this is a situation. They are doing better than us, for sure. When we talk about labor costs, there is a huge difference between Germany and the rest of the European economies. Another thing that we have to work very carefully in Portugal and in Spain, what is happening with the patents? You have to realize that if you want to export machinery, you want to do key-term projects, you want to do big projects, you are using foreign patents. So if you are exporting foreign patents, then you have to pay to Canada, to France, to the US, to Japan, who knows. And when we see what is the number of patents in these countries in Europe, what we are seeing is that suddenly, I mean, for example, the situation in Portugal and in Spain is one of the worst that you have. I mean, you compare 273 patents in Germany, every 1,000 employees, and for example, in Portugal it's just 7, or in Spain it's just 35. So it's really important to work on that for the future. So at the end, what is happening with the companies, or what are the big issues that the companies are facing in Europe? First of all, the corporates are facing difficult to access to the credit. And this is important because, you know, last week, for example, the European Central Bank has decreased the interest rate to 0.25, but the main issue is that the corporates are not getting that credit. What is happening? What is that credit? Looks like many times the banks are giving that money to the government, to the own government, instead to the corporates. That is really important. Once again, another big difference with Germany and the rest of the European countries is the easiness. I mean, if we are having this data, you see that, for example, at least in Germany is positive the credit from one year to the other that is being delivered to corporates. And for example, in Spain, the decrease has been very heavily. If you don't have access to liquidity to the banks, then you need the liquidity of the supplier. And if the supplier is Portuguese, you are going to be paid later. This is quite obvious, but this is something that is important for you. Second thing that is really important is that what is happening with the public sector. 5 years ago, it was big. It was a big thing. It was huge to sell to the public sector. But the public sector, in average, is paying 150 days, 180 days. Then you go to the banks in order to discount. But once again, it's feasible, it's something that you can do. What we are seeing is that, for example, in Spain and in Portugal, I mean, the average of payment of the government is around 160 days, and this is huge. Another issue that is happening in Europe, a structural situation, structural effects. What does it mean that? It means what is the amount? What is the amount of people that are working in each company? And as we always said, I mean, companies, the small and medium enterprise, in average, in Germany, for example, they are a lot bigger than, for example, in Portugal and in Spain. The small and medium enterprise, the pymes, are smaller. That means that you are weaker when you are going outside, and this is that you have to look after. After that, one of the things that I want to point out is that we are facing this situation of short cycle effects. That means that it looks like we were coming out of the crisis and suddenly we go back a little bit So we have 5 challenges. The first challenge is margin gain versus margin squeeze. This is really important. I guess that a lot of people, when they export 5 years ago, it was because they were expecting to increase the margin. This is possible today. You have to realize that you are selling to emerging markets. You are a country of $28,000 income per capita a year, and suddenly you are selling to a country that has a $6,000 income per capita. How is it possible to sell that if you are not selling Rolex or Ferraris? Perhaps your margin has to decrease a little bit when you are exporting, although it's good, it's quite obvious that you have to have a positive margin. That is important. The second challenge is the credit shortage. The credit shortage. I think one of the things that we have to look after is that that credit goes back to corporates in Europe in 2014, because it will be a good idea for all of you. Why this is important? Because I insist that when you are selling to emerging markets, you are getting paid not in 30 days, not in 60 days, but perhaps in 180 days, 120 days. That is important. The public sector, once again, this is something that we have said before. I mean, the late payment of the public sector, the structural effect that they are having, and not enough time to breathe. What does it mean, not enough time to breathe? As you are seeing is that we are facing many changes in Portuguese companies in the last years. And what we are seeing is that, for example, the indices, the payments in the last year is increasing. I mean, we have to change many things really fast, and we don't have time. We have to improve really fast. So just ending my presentation, I wanted to present to you, I guess that one of the things that is quite relevant regarding Coface is we analyze countries, but we also analyze sectors. In this first slide, you have the sectors regarding the European Union. You see that, for example, the black is the worst, the red, and the yellow, and we are talking about what is the situation, for example, in this sector. To analyze a country is quite obvious, but it's completely different if you are selling to the automotive industry, or the steel industry, or the construction industry. And one of the things that we are looking quite carefully in the European Union today is the automobile industry and the metal industry, the iron industry. All this information, you have it in coface.com, but this is something that is really relevant regarding the difference between one sector and the other. When we look after North America, imagine that, for example, you are trying to sell to North America, to the US, that we think that is, I mean, I said before, is the biggest seller worldwide. You have to realize that the sector that we are more concerned is the iron sector. So you will have more difficulty in order to obtain a risk from us if you are selling in the iron industry in, for example, the US, that in the situation that if you are working, for example, with the energy industry. And the last one regarding these developing economies, for sure, is emerging Asia. Emerging Asia, I mean, you have their economies that they are quite interesting, like, for example, Japan, or quite obvious, like Singapore, for example, that they have a huge demand. And what you see is that we are a little bit skeptical, once again, regarding the metal industry and regarding the chemical industry. So it's important, I insist, to analyze how the country is doing, but then you have to go a little bit down, a little bit deeper, in order to analyze how the sectors are performing in those countries. These ones are the last 2 slides of my presentation, and first of all, I want to, remember that what we do in Coface is to rate the countries in order to cover the political, the credit risk that they are facing our clients, that they are exporters or investors. That rating is like the high school grades. We have the A, that is the best, and is the D, that is the worst. So when you look after coface.com and you are looking to the rating, you have this A1, A2, A3, A4, B, C, D. Anyone that is, aware of the OECD will realize that this 7 category is quite common when you are looking after the countries. I insist, instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is this A, B, C, and D. And this is the situation. This is the situation in 2013, in September 2013. This is not the league, this is not the football league, this is not the Benfica, the Real Madrid. What we are talking about is how good or how bad a country is paying. That means that if your rating has decreased in the last years, And it's quite important to see, for example, how the rating has decreased, for example, in Spain being your biggest importer. You have to realize today is a big country. I used to be an A1 country in 2008 and A3 country in 2011, means that it's going to be more difficult to you, or more expensive perhaps, because for the credit insurance companies it will mean that you have more risk, and for the bank also is going to imply that you have more risk. You have all this information in coface.com. I mean, when you are traveling around, I think it's a good idea just to check into the country risk analysis inside of coface.com and see what Coface thinks about Angola or Brazil or France or Italy, that they are the countries that we were talking before. Thanks a lot. Muito obrigado.